Welcome to Civic Warriors, brought to you by Witham. On this podcast, we bring the conversation to you, sharing engaging stories that motivate and build consensus in the nonprofit community. This podcast is about the innovators, the leaders on the front lines of adversity, guiding lights in the nonprofit industry affecting change. And through their stories, we can all join forces to become Civic Warriors. Hey Warriors, welcome to today's episode of Civic Warriors, brought to you by Witham. I'm your host, Brad Caruso, leader of Witham's not-for-profit practice. Today's guest is Alec Hinkson, Chief Financial Officer and Executive Vice President of Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, a 501c3 not-for-profit organization. RPA helps donors create thoughtful, effective philanthropy. They do this by providing advisory, management, and implementation services for families, foundations, and other philanthropic initiatives, by incubating innovative and early-stage nonprofits and donor collaboratives, and by sharing insights and producing publications on philanthropic approaches, strategies, and practices. We're going to talk today about how RPA helps its donors and clients and how they strengthen philanthropy in the industry as a whole. And we're going to talk about a couple of topics related to fiscal sponsorships and other areas that RPA helps. So with that said, Alec, welcome to the show.
Hey, Brad. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Super excited to have you. I know I've been talking to you for a while about getting you on, and I'm happy that I finally coerced you to be on the show here. So where I wanted to start, and where I always like to hear, is people's background and kind of how they got to where they are. So maybe Alex, share a little bit about how you arrived at RPA, some of the prior causes you worked with, and you can give us a full history or a short history, whatever you prefer.
Try to give you a short history because, as always said, I'm older than I look. And I think, Brad, you and I met about 10 years ago at the Rainforest Alliance, right?
That's correct, yeah.
So I spent the last 25 years of my career at the intersection of finance, operations, and mission-driven organizations. Before joining RPA last year, I worked at Deloitte, one of your peers, but also in sort of their nonprofit consulting practice. I had this sort of dual role of doing for-profit and nonprofit consulting. Went on to Columbia University, the International Rescue Committee, a New York City-based educational organization called Prep for Prep, the Rainforest Alliance, where we met each other, and most recently at the World Resources Institute. So, and all finance roles, broader operational roles, CFO plus roles, if you will. And much of my work in those places was sort of helping these organizations scale their impact responsibly, building financial infrastructure, strengthening governance, and aligning resources with impact on a pretty massive global scale. We're talking, some organizations that expand to about 60 countries. The IRC now is probably about $1 billion a year organization. And I was their head of international finance there. And, being a CFO in these organizations just gave me a great view into how they work and how essential they are to the world and how the broader nonprofit sector operates. So that's a little bit of my background. I won't go all the way back to, when I was born and and that sort of stuff. Although a lot of my early history kind of dictates, how I ended up in this space today, just sort of like what my parents cared about and where I was born, born in Guyana, South America. So like that has always influenced my view on the world.
Yeah, I think it's super important. And you have, certainly in my experience working with you, you've worked with some of the largest of large nonprofits with some, really complex operations. And being in the role you're in is obviously a challenging role, but you brought a lot of that expertise, both from the financial reporting activity, understanding how businesses operate, but also I think your background in just what you care about culturally, what you care about in the organizations you work with has helped. What do you think drove you to this nonprofit industry as a whole, or what, just diving a little bit further into it? How did you get into caring about some of the missions of these organizations and working with them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd like to give you this origin story where, I was born in a field and some
no.
and a lightning storm struck or something like that. I came to the US when I was 6, and a lot of my sort of inspiration for doing purpose-driven work in retrospect has everything to do with my parents, right? My father stayed in Guyana, and he was a little bit of a rabble rouser, really sort of pushed the government's limits a little bit, if you will. And his story is a really interesting story. One day I want to kind of write something about it. But I spent most of my formative years, or all my formative years, with my mother, who was an educator, and she became really ill early on. And coming out of college, I had no idea what I wanted to do. So one of my very first jobs actually ended up being at a medical center in Brooklyn, right? So a place called the Brownsville Multi-Service Family Health Center, working specifically as like their bookkeeper and HIV case management program. I think maybe folks will remember like the Ryan White Act many, many years ago. So that program was funded by Ryan White. And it was interesting. I mean, this is stuff I can only look back on now, because when I was there, I was just like, I need a job. I need something to do. And what it did for me was really like, and I'm going to share something like incredibly personal, which is easier to talk about right now. My mother contracted HIV in the early 90s, and she passed away in 96, right? So it's like 30 years ago. And that program gave me an opportunity to really understand her illness through working with others and just trying to get a really good sense of their journeys, but also seeing what she was going through. And it really sort of solidified for me what I wanted to do. I had no idea, right? And I was trying to figure out what I wanted to study. I'd recently come back from studying civil engineering, which I hated. And the CFO of this center really encouraged me to study finance and accounting. I ended up going to Baruch, and that made a huge difference in my life, right? So without me even knowing, right? So these things that were happening in my life that seemed like, tragedy or perilous or somehow, really depressing, kind of like started pushing me toward this more purpose-driven life.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, certainly personal story, but also what I've found in most people that work in this industry, it's those personal stories that do drive them to care about the industry, to really care about others. You have to, in order to work in this industry, you have to care about others. You have to have a desire to, improve the world on a greater scale than just, my small ecosystem that I live in. And I think your connection to a lot of these, your personal background, as well as your connection to a lot of these causes, I think is what helps you be great at your job. And you have a way of talking about things. And in working with you for many years, I know that you express things in a certain way. And I know that it's that passion that makes you successful. So it's, appreciate you sharing more about that. I think it's important.
That's really, really kind of you, Brad. Thank you. And I would say the same of you. And I know you're slightly on a different side, but you work with, many, many nonprofit clients. And I see the same. And I also know a little bit about, how you spend your
how I spend my spare time.
I believe, and, I've got two now older kids, 24 and 21. And, I really try to inspire them, no matter what they do. There's nothing wrong with going out in the world and making tons and tons and tons of money, but just make sure that there is an element of it that really kind of speaks to your purpose or soul or whatever we call it, right? So it's important to contribute to society as a whole. And yeah, that informs a lot of the way that I think about, something as quote unquote mundane as financial management. It's like, it's the story wrapped around the way that we interact in the world. We are in interesting times. So I think that, more than ever, we need more and more people doing that kind of stuff.
Without a doubt. Yeah. We're in interesting times, and leave it there.
We
have a couple things to talk about.
We'll leave it there. But but you had a second part of that question. So what drew me to RPA? And I'll stick with the corniness. The very first thing is the people. We just had a board meeting last week, and I was just kind of reflecting in the virtual room, because it was a virtual board meeting, about, what an awesome board we have, chaired by Valerie Rockefeller, how brilliant our leadership team is, led by Nick Campbell and Walter Sweet. Those are our co-CEOs. And then we, have this really awesome broader leadership team. And that all sort of emanates and trickles down to our core teams, our finance team, our people and culture team, our legal team, our advisory team, and of course, our sponsored projects team. I don't know that and I'm going to get myself in trouble.
Don't get yourself in trouble.
Because I've worked with some pretty amazing people, many of whom, I don't know that I've worked with, sort of a more brilliant, kind, and committed collective I just really love it here. So that was like the first thing that drew me here. And the second is what I have come to understand about RPA. And we'll talk a little bit more about what this means, right? As we discuss things, I'm going to steal a term from one of my colleagues, right? So this sort of force multiplier is the way that I think we think of ourselves, right? So instead of me being CFO or us being the support system for one organization, we support 100 charitable projects and hundreds of donors deploying billions of dollars around the world. So we're the sort of legal and fiduciary house for these initiatives, allowing them to really focus on the mission while we provide operational backbone. And that's really, and we'll talk more about this, the way I think about fiscal sponsorship and what's exciting about it, right? So the ability to be this leverage point for so much good around the planet. And maybe the last one, I can't ignore the brand. The Rockefeller name is pretty well known and well respected in the space. It's a name you can trust. It's been around for, centuries, sort of growing out of wealth and transforming into all of these other really important philanthropic organizations, the foundation, RPA, the fund, and on and on. So, it's those three things, the team, the force multiplier effect, and the brand that really have drawn me to RPA and are keeping me here.
Yeah, love that answer. And as an aside, for everyone out there that listens here about, how do I attract talent? How do I attract the right people to my organization? I think Alec just gave a roadmap for how to do that. This is a people business, and most businesses are, especially in the nonprofit world, they're people businesses first. And how do you connect with people? And it's everyone in your organization. So, the board's involved with those discussions. And when you're attracting, CEOs, CFOs, high level talent, at the end of the day, you have to have an infrastructure that supports that and a culture that supports that. Whereas the board interacts, upper management interacts, and you can tell the tension if there's tension in interview processes and things like that. And, to your point, the brand and it works the same for my business too in public accounting. I mean, at the end of the day, when I hire people, I don't ask them technical questions. And, for anyone listening that's trying to get hired by us, I don't ask technical questions because at the end of the day, you'll prove to me whether you know the technical or not in your first 2 months being here. However, if you can't work with me on a level that we can get along and we can enjoy the work environment together, then we're not going to get along. It's not going to work out. So it's that connection. And then like, as you said, you joined a reputable brand. That's certainly important. Joining, an organization that has values and that purports those values and maintains those values over a very long period of time, which is very difficult to do. But maintaining true to your values, I think, is an important aspect. So appreciate that insight because I think it's often overlooked from what I've heard from various parties that I've worked with in my career.
Totally agree.
So switching gears a little bit, when we think about philanthropy, obviously RPA in the business of philanthropy, how do you define philanthropy? And what are some of the ways that you feel RPA helps accelerate that philanthropy? You just shared, a little bit about it, but maybe go a little bit more in depth into how you kind of define philanthropy and what it means.
Thank you for that question. This is such a big question, Brad.
I know. It's a loaded question.
It's a big question. It's a loaded question. And, I've been thinking about it for a while, and it's just what's really strange and funny is that I was kind of playing around with this idea. And then recently, one of my colleagues, her name is Teresa Schreiber. She's one of the advisors, what sort of philanthropic consultants within our organization. In February, posted a blog post that's really about philanthropy as society's risk capital, right? So you could think about philanthropy as generosity of spirit and time and money. But, if you want to get a little finance nerdy, it's that, right? So markets and businesses are, supposedly in the world to optimize for profit and financial returns, right? So it's really short term. How much money do you make for your shareholders? Governments provide this broader structure and framing for public goods, but they're constrained by politics and policy and can be slow. Philanthropy is pretty special, right? It can move fast, it can take risks, it can invest in long-term solutions to really complex social and environmental problems. So, if you think about it in this sort of capital stack, I think philanthropy sits right sort of, in the middle. It gives space to governments and markets to play in their spaces, but can pick up the slack in terms of what societal good and innovation can look like. I thought that was like such a powerful framing for me. And again, it's like, it's a little wonky, right? But philanthropy is pretty sophisticated. So I love the turn of phrase, the change of language, the way to kind of think about it when you're talking to somebody who has got $100 to give or $100 million to give. It's really about providing that risk capital so that folks who have this passion, these social entrepreneurs, can go out and make real change in the world.
Yeah, it definitely is an efficient and effective way to drive an impact. And as you said, it could be small dollars, it could be large dollars, and that drives the scale of impact that can be had. But also, I appreciate that your response there was kind of like a financial steward. You're that middle ground of driving significant change in society and being responsible about driving that significant change in society in a way that the government can't do because of the bureaucratic protocols that are in place, and which the private businesses aren't doing because of the profit motive. You're in that in-between space. But we do, in our industry, view it as kind of a for-profit endeavor from the perspective that you're driving an impact, and it will have a financial impact. It just may not be for your organization.
Exactly. I mean, that financial impact, that ROI, that return is, sort of measured out in the world, and it's not necessarily for us. Of course, I always have to say this, philanthropies, nonprofits are still businesses. We still have to, maintain the same sort of stewardship, rigor, compliance, sometimes more than the private sector, many times more than
definitely more. Yeah, there's no question about that. It's actually more. I mean, the level of accountability is not only to a group of, if all you had to do is submit your audit report to your board, or your 990 to your board, okay, now you're comparable to the for-profit industry.
Yeah, you're done.
The second they, the private for-profit, ignore the public company world, but now you add that extra layer of, well, anybody can access your tax return. Your audit report, most nonprofits now put them on their website. So everybody can access your audit report. Everybody can access, information about the organization because it's publicly available. I mean, that's a high standard to live up to. That's often untalked about. Your compensation is disclosed on a form out there for the world. I mean, that would scare a lot of for-profit people. I will tell you that.
Exactly. Everybody knows. And,
everybody knows.
I think that, there's, and then I want to come back to, the question about acceleration. There is something really good and just about transparency, right? So it keeps us all on our toes and makes sure that we're doing what we're saying. And I think it makes for a better organization, frankly. And, taking those practices that we have to put out in the world and bringing them internally. You talked about culture. That's certainly something that we practice within RPA. We have all colleagues meetings. We share as much as we can, as broadly as we can within the organization, not only as a matter of trust, but, I think it's important for folks to know the business that they're in, the water they're swimming in. And it just really ups the game within RPA and within the sector. Just really important.
Yeah, totally agree with that. And I lead a group of about 300 people now, and I've implemented a phase of transparency from the degree that I put myself on a limb saying, hey, here's like a success and here's failure. Like I show people both, like this is what success looks like. This is what failure looks like. And I'm in both shoes every single day of my life. And I'll share stories about my life, and whether it's in the fire department or it's in my personal life with my kids, or whether it's in work where I've had, big successes and big failures on both ends of the spectrum. That's one way I've implemented that as well. Is it, that transparency is super important. And I do see a lot of value with it is, you don't want to hide from it. At the end of the day, we're afraid of how people are going to react to the truth and the reality. But as humans, I think transparency is certainly the best policy and without a doubt. So I appreciate that as a comment you made. So RPA, how does RPA accelerate this philanthropic world? Yeah, because there's a lot that you do. There's a lot of different ways that you drive impact in the world. So maybe share a little bit about how RPA functions from that perspective.
Yeah, Brad, you only ask easy questions, by the way.
That's the whole point. Let me just take 35 loaded questions and just download your brain onto this podcast. It's gonna be great.
All right, so I will.
You can tell me to stop at any time. I can.
No, it's okay. I will do my best to try to encapsulate this, because this is a difficult concept to explain without me pushing you toward our thought leadership team or insights and inquiry team, or having you sit through days of our strategy sessions. So I'm going to try to capture it as best I understand it. So we help accelerate philanthropy by providing strategy and execution. And that's really about working with the donors who come to us. As I mentioned, we have an advisory practice. We have a fiscal sponsorship practice, and we've got this thing called thought leadership or insights and inquiry. So the first aspect of acceleration is really working with donors and helping them through a justice lens understand what their goals are and how they can move. Ideally, they've been incredibly successful in their lives, working in the private sector. And they get to a point in their lives when they're like, okay, well, it's time for me to think about family, legacy, faith. And we'll talk a little bit about the philanthropic roadmap a little bit later. But that's kind of like, to me, the first part of acceleration. It's really like bringing folks up to speed, learning, helping them structure and think about their giving strategy. The second part is the largest part of our business, which is, fiscal sponsorship. It's getting ideas and nonprofits that are just in sort of incubation stage up and running rather rapidly in an economical way, right? So it's going from idea to scale as quickly as possible and not having to take the slightly longer road of, do I want to be a tax exempt organization? What does that mean? I need to go talk to my lawyer. I need to, that process can take a long time. We are there to provide that accelerant to help a project or a nonprofit really get to scale rather rapidly. And then finally, that's all wrapped in just world-class research and boundary-pushing thought leadership that goes back decades. So we've got this sort of real depth of knowledge that informs the entire space. What is justice? What is philanthropy? What are your goals, right? Our insights and inquiry or thought leadership team does quite a bit of this, research, paper writing, convening to help folks understand sort of what the norms of the space are, but what the sort of next thing is. So I'm not sure that I captured that as concisely and as precisely as I wanted, but it's really about working with donors to help them, rapidly understand what their giving goals are, inviting, these projects and organizations in to help them scale quickly, and then wrapping that all around like real learning. You talked about failures, right? And successes, really just understanding the space a little bit and trying to make the space itself richer, better, stronger.
I thought you explained that extraordinarily well in a very concise manner. I think that's phenomenal how you explain that, because it is a difficult concept to understand. But if I think some of the items that you pointed out there, which I felt, drive the point home is, you're listening to what donors would like to do with their wealth and how they can make an impact in the world. You obviously do a lot of research and understanding as an organization and have a thought leadership department that really understands a lot of probably very granular metrics of how the world operates and where philanthropy is needed. The infrastructure that it takes to run your own charitable organization is extraordinarily complicated. Even if you want to, people say, "Oh, I just want to start a simple charity." Like, there's nothing simple about it. There are a lot of hoops you have to jump through. And as much as you want to say, "Hey, I'm just a small organization," that's fine. It's like, well, yeah, but you as the $100,000 organization has to follow the same exact protocols and standards as the $1 billion organization, unfortunately. And I think that's an often understood fact. You can have infrastructure as a $1 billion organization. As a $100,000 organization, you're doing it all yourself. You're dealing with it. So it's very difficult to operate a project on $100,000 or $1 million as opposed to operating at scale. And it sounds like from what I heard from you, you offer that infrastructure so that you don't have to go through all of that compliance. You're the compliance arm, and they're the operational arm of how you operate, of how they operate.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. We're the compliance arm. We're the backbone. I mean, we provide compliance. We have financial services we provide, which is, sort of financial reporting, budgeting, planning. We are the employer of record as well, right? So we are hiring hundreds and hundreds of people for these projects across the globe, right? So think about like your point. You've got a $100,000 charity or nonprofit, and I want to operate in like 20 countries. I would say you could probably do it. It's going to be pretty hard. And, we provide that infrastructure and backbone. also in terms of sort of legal vetting of grants across the globe, making sure that those things are all buttoned up. And of course, we've got a group of sponsored projects advisors who sort of ride along with each one of these projects to make sure that they understand programmatically, along with what it means to be compliant with a donor or a government set of funding. So it's nice. It's a nice container to get started and grow. My deep confession, Brad, is that, and maybe not so surprising, is that I didn't know as much about fiscal sponsorship before I joined the RPA as I do now. It is a, pretty tremendous and rich sort of ecosystem. And I think just an incredibly important part of the philanthropic landscape.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I would say I may be going on a limb here, but I think 10 years ago, much of the world didn't know. I think fiscal sponsorship was not as, I don't want to say mainstream, but not as prominent as it is today. It definitely has been an area in the philanthropy world that has kicked up. There's a lot of these areas that I think giving has changed. So, you see a lot of, donor advised fund type entities pop up, and that's a big giving vehicle. Fiscal sponsorship is a big way as a giving vehicle. And then there's a million one other ways. But yeah, it definitely is a trend that I've seen as well. But, very clearly, you guys are experts at it. And I think it's good, the world to understand that. I guess just on that topic, how does a fiscal sponsorship type arrangement differ from, say, like a donor advised fund, right? Like you hear, I think publicly donor advised funds have been like a really big vehicle. They're actually coming under some scrutiny right now in the grand scheme of the world publicly. But, how would you compare yourself on the fiscal sponsorship type model to a donor advised fund model?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's not just nuance or splitting hairs. It's very different. And by the way,
very different.
Full disclosure, RPA also has some donor advised funds that we manage. And, I would describe a donor advised fund, and I'd love to hear what you're hearing, by the way, about the scrutiny. I'm just kind of like,
I'll give you very simply, people don't read legal language in the world. Legal agreements are important. When someone hands you a legal agreement and you sign it, I think you need to read the legal agreement. So I scrutiny from the perspective that I think people challenge legal agreements, but I don't think it's a bad model. And
what I've heard in the past is the critique that donor advised funds have just been accumulating tons of money. I think something like $300 billion at last count. And there's not enough distribution happening from DAFs, right? So a DAF to me, it's essentially a charitable investment account, right? So you, Brad, you got $100, you got a desire to do good in the world. You open up an investment account with RPA or Fidelity or you name it, right? And you're like, I want you guys to hold that $100. And at some point I will tell you where I want to have that money donated to. That's just, the simple version of a DAF. A sponsored project is similar, right? So Brad says, I've got $100. I'd like to give it to a sponsored project. The sponsored project obviously is housed by RPA, but sponsored projects can operate, right? Beyond just kind of like handing out grants and moving money at the behest of a donor. It's really about operating a full nonprofit in service of mission. So neither is good or bad. They're just different ways of thinking about giving, and they have different operating capabilities, right? The DAF kind of like ends at money in, and over time, some distributions out to, some really good causes. Sponsored projects or fiscal sponsors can take that money in, hold it, and actually operate the same way any other nonprofit would. So we don't get into this space, but we could buy fire trucks and operate an entire, sort of nonprofit, locally sponsored fire department. A DAF cannot do that. But that's essentially, the difference. And as I mentioned, RPA does hold and manage DAFs for a number of donors. We think it's a good vehicle. It's just different from fiscal sponsorship.
Definitely. Yeah. And there are many different vehicles in the philanthropic world. And those are two different models, which have two different intents and purposes, and both work. I think it's just a question of, as you said, what is the donor's intent from the outset? So I think that's super important. So driving into this topic of fiscally sponsored projects, can you share a couple examples of how RPA has helped some of those projects? Can you share a couple examples and project type areas or put in a little context a little further to what a fiscally sponsored project looks like?
Yeah, I could do. Can I zoom out a little bit first?
You can zoom out. Sure. Absolutely.
Way out and then way back in. And, sort of in the nerdiness of it all, there is an organization called Social Impact Commons, right? So it's like this fiscal sponsorship community of practice. And they recently did a sort of convening and a report. And I was shocked to sort of see the results. One of our colleagues went to join this convening virtually. And as a side note, last November, I went to the annual National Society of Fiscal Sponsors. It's like 350 like fiscal sponsorship geeks. They're like folks are like really excited about fiscal sponsorship. It's like this whole world. It's really interesting. So Social Commons estimates that there are about 1,400 fiscal sponsors in the U.S. managing about $69 billion in assets. And that's a pretty massive scale, right? RPA is one of the largest fiscal sponsors. As I mentioned, we have about 100 projects and about $1 billion of assets under management. So we are helping these 100 projects transact work from across the sort of spectrum of arts, education, climate, you name it. Anything that's got a real and important charitable purpose, we do it alongside many others. And two stand out. I mean, the reason I kind of zoom all the way out is just kind of give a sense of like the industry and the scale and importance that it holds, and where we sit within that. Two projects stand out just for their recency and sort of size. And as I mentioned, it doesn't have to be this massive or this complicated for us to host a project. But the first one is Plastic Solutions Fund. And in January, me and some of my colleagues, our COO and our Chief Sustainability and Strategy Officer and one of our advisors on the sponsored project side met with their leadership to kind of figure out what they wanted to do next. Plastic Solutions Fund is an organization that's been around for 10 years. All of its 10 years, it's been with RPA. And its stated goal really is to eliminate plastic waste around the world. It's pretty big. It started out relatively small about 10 years ago. Let's say about $1 million. This coming year, it's going to be at probably about $120 million project, funded by many different donors. Actually, just recently was publicly announced that they won the Audacious Prize, which is sort of, this thing created by TED Talks. And every year they run, a prize for big ideas. And this is one of them. And again, that's what their mission is. They're out in the world working with other organizations to improve policy, to ensure that governments are signing on to, the plastics tree, to ensure ultimately that plastic waste is eliminated in the next 10 to 15 years, ideally, through reuse, reduction, and other measures. So that's one, it's like really, really, really big. I would say, the punchline from this meeting is the good news is that they are deciding to stay with RPA. There's a natural life cycle where projects come in, they incubate, they grow, and then they get to a particular size where they spin off. They might decide that they need their own infrastructure. Apparently, we have done a pretty good job for them, so they're staying. The second example, which is also fairly large, is called Humanity AI. It's a $500 million donor collaborative, right? And I'm going to pause for a second to describe what a donor collaborative is, because I think it's especially good for fiscal sponsorship. We've seen it grow a lot over the last 5 years, let's say. And fiscal sponsorship is good because you've got, large foundations or large donors who want a sort of neutral home to make sure that a particular idea, project, or outcome is delivered in an effective way instead of one foundation sort of owning it themselves. Fiscal sponsorship makes that really effective. So Humanity AI is a $500 million collaborative that's funded by MacArthur and others, just launched last year. It's really about trying to answer the question of, we've got this thing, we've got this powerful tool. There's a lot of concern about it as it relates to democracy, education, humanities and culture, the economy and labor, all these disruptions, and then ultimately privacy and security. How do we make sure that we put enough investment into the world to make sure that there are some good and thoughtful guardrails? So those are two projects that we host that are fairly massive. I mentioned that it doesn't have to be that big or that complicated, and it doesn't have to be in the climate space or, the AI space. It can just be any organization that has a great idea that's got a charitable purpose. And, we will vet them, and ultimately, if it works out, we'll host them.
It's a lot of information. It definitely gives context to it, though. And it gives a lot of context to, there's projects, some very, very large projects. There are, an impact that you're making. There are different ways to approach it. And, it certainly is an important vehicle. And once again, gives context to what it means. If you had, zero-based knowledge going into this and said, what is a fiscally sponsored project? What does it mean? I think that gives a lot of clarity to what it means. So I appreciate your thoughtful and detailed explanation there.
Sure. Yeah, I'm sorry. I think I nerded out a little bit there, but
you might have.
I try to keep things simple, but all right, okay.
So Alec, what I heard from you is that you make great projects better.
That is a really awesome way to describe what RPA does and what fiscal sponsorship is.
Definitely. And so on that, I guess furthering that topic, if you talk about like the life cycle of a fiscally sponsored project, you talked about it briefly, but how does someone start a fiscally sponsored project? Like, how does it incubate from, I'm Brad, I got an idea. I want to, build a firehouse here, but I don't want to start my own fire company. How does that idea incubate from an idea to having a fiscally sponsored project?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you have an idea. It all starts with a good idea. One that is mission driven. I could shamelessly plug RPA here for a second, right? So reach out to us, info@rockpa.org. And often, projects come to us because they are aware of us. Other projects might refer them to us. You need a mission, you need a leadership team, and you need a funding plan to start. Our fiscal sponsorship team and advisors will conduct some diligence. This in terms of whether or not this is a charitable purpose. We'll work with our legal team internally, to make sure that you are compliant, both in terms of the money you're receiving and your intended use of funds. We also have a board, as I mentioned. We have to seek their approval to make sure that, they are aware of, and good with, your particular project. We'll sign a project agreement, and then we'll insert you into our pre-existing structure, right? So making good ideas better is what we do. And we take you on the journey, right? So you may know nothing about fiscal sponsorship. You may know nothing about, nonprofit management. As we were saying, it's far more complicated than a lot of folks realize. We will onboard you and bring you in and help you understand that bit as much as you like, sometimes more than you like. That's an essential piece. It's not a set it and forget it situation. It's, come along with us on this journey where we can provide compliance, financial reporting, people and legal structure. So that's kind of the start. And then off you go.
And then you make an impact.
Then you make an impact. Then, I could use the Classic Solutions Fund as the example, right? So coming in initially with, a funding plan, a couple donors who had an idea to fund this big idea, and they came to RPA with those pieces, right? So we have a charitable purpose. We've got some donors. We've got some idea of what our infrastructure needs to be. We don't say completely don't worry about it, but we got you. We're the backbone. We're the operations. We can help you think about like your operations out in the world, but most people who come to us have a sense of how they want to like deliver their mission. But yeah, it's off you go, with some, touch points, pretty regular touch points, in fact, between the leadership team and folks who are responsible for operations with RPA. So it's a guided journey.
Yeah, it sounds like a significant partnership among many parties, and leveraging extensive knowledge from a variety of perspectives that help a sponsored project go from, like you said, an idea to making that impact. But it's that environment and that ecosystem that you provide, or that support system or support structure that you provide that helps with the success of a project itself. So, I think that's understated in you can't put it to words, because the reality is, if you just tried to start a project on your own, right? Like I said, if I go out and try to start my project on my own, what support system do I have to help make that happen? It's on me.
Exactly. You are the chief, the cook, and the bottle washer. You're everything.
You are everything, which is a scary thing. It's not easy to do.
And like, even if it's, to your point, I love that. Even it's just like having the comfort of having partnership. I think that's worth every penny, but it comes, it's much more than that, right? So you got a fiscal sponsor advisor who takes you on this journey. You've got your sponsor project finance person. You've got your sponsor project HR person. So, these are folks who are helping you, not just in the beginning, but, through the entire life cycle of your project. And you can be sure that, these things are done properly, legally compliant, because we take that seriously, right? It's our charitable status, that we're putting, into the mix as well.
No, without a doubt. Yeah, it has to be that mutual partnership, and it can't be a one-sided relationship with that. You as an organization, as you said, you have a very strong reputation to maintain, and that includes every project underneath the organization or within the organization. So we talked a lot about fiscal sponsorships, which I think is great. I really appreciate your knowledge and insight, and certainly, one of the experts in the industry, both yourself and the organization as a whole. In thinking about some other items, and as I was kind of preparing for this discussion, just in looking in your website, RPA obviously has probably one of the most detailed and descriptive knowledge centers on a website, and has a lot of information out there that's beneficial to charities. One of the things that struck my attention that if you want to share a little bit about is you have this concept as an organization called the Philanthropy Roadmap. Can you share a little bit more about what that Philanthropy Roadmap is and what it means?
I'm happy to. And first, I'm going to, I got to tell our comms team and our insights and inquiry team and our thought leadership team that you gave them such kudos.
Tell them that an accountant loved your website.
You're like, oh man, Brad.
I really do. I will say, I went and I'm like, this is one of the most well laid out sites. And I love just like different things. And I'm developing ours here at Witham for the nonprofit side, and I'm trying to get our website game up to, similar to how a lot of charitable organizations have it. And the things I notice are, poignant statements, videos, guides that can help people, constant updated information, consistent knowledge, information that's on a real-time relevant basis. And, all of those things, you've checked more than those boxes and are probably the gold standard from what I'm seeing. So I will give kudos directly, just in all seriousness. Yeah.
Thank you, Brad. Your endorsement matters a lot. We take, I'll get to your specific question after enjoying the glow here. But we take that seriously, right? So we play an important role in the space, right? So, we think of ourselves as one of the leaders, our ability to, bring in others to think about what philanthropy means, what fiscal sponsorship means. It is really critically important. So, our thought leadership team will be happy to hear about this. But you point out something really important. We talked a lot about fiscal sponsorship. What is important to know or interesting to know is that when RPA spun off from the family office in 2002, it was primarily about philanthropic advising. Fiscal sponsorship came later, almost as a, sort of organic side thought. The core root, the heritage of RPA is really about consulting with folks who want to give. And that means we have some of the world's best philanthropic consultants to help you, wealthy Brad, on your philanthropic journey. It's really a cornerstone of what we do. And our philanthropy roadmap helps do that, right? Right. And we could see it on our website, to your point. I think it's really clear, and it takes you through these steps, and obviously better digested with someone who can walk you through these steps. But it asks about 5 key questions. Brad, why are you giving? Why are we having this conversation at all? Is it about family? Is it about legacy? Is it about your faith? Why are you here at this moment? And not everybody's got that answer. or maybe it's not as well formed, or, they've got half an answer. And that's what the roadmap is intended to help bring out. Right. So why are you here at this moment with us and wanting to give? Second is, what change do you want to see as a result of your giving? There's so many options in the world. As I mentioned, we host lots of different organizations, from arts to education to climate, AI. I mentioned that stuff. Just kind of the spectrum. And that reflects the spectrum of what folks find important. So what's the change you want to see? And this is number 3. How do you think that change can happen? Obviously with your intervention. So why are you giving? What do you want to see happen with your giving? And how do you think that's going to happen? And then importantly, we think this is important, but this is not a new concept, right? So we talk about, measuring impact and measuring success. How would you measure? So like, success when the money's over? Is success when a particular neighborhood or particular topic has been solved, or a portion of it? How do you do that? How do you want to measure the end of this journey? And just side note, having been in the nonprofit and philanthropy world for a long time, change is really long term. So you sometimes have to break it down in more digestible moments. And the last question, number 5, is who do you want to partner with, right? And that is, are there particular people, organizations that you want to give to? Are there folks you want to collaborate with? I mentioned donor collaboratives for a brief moment there. Is there a way for you to multiply or amplify your own philanthropy by working with others on a particular topic? I think it's one of the most really inspirational and clear roadmaps. It is so simple in its delivery, but obviously addresses some pretty complex and sometimes for deeply personal things.
Yeah, I love every minute of that. And I think that gives a lot of just relevant information to a lot of the audience and a lot of people that are trying to make a difference. All of those questions are very poignant, and they do drive you into a direction that trying to solve the overriding need, but there are things that you have to answer before you get to that point. And also, to your point, you're an advisor at heart, and I think that advisory component is what's important. Is you're listening and saying, okay, we're taking in all this information, and then we can better advise you, because if we don't know all that information, we're just providing a solution that may not necessarily fit said desires, and then that's not always the best basis for a partnership to start out. So.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Right. So it's really about level setting, and it's about information sharing, and it's about, building this foundation of trust and partnership, because there's so many ways to give, so many things. So do you want to start a foundation? Do you just want us to help you find organizations to give to? Do you want to go and save the puppies from the floods like you do? What does this mean to you? And it's really good framing to help folks go from an idea to this question of accelerating.
Love it. Last question. How does RPA think about impact with the projects that you have? I guess this is a really loaded question. Maybe we could strike that.
It is, but you know what?
It's a good question. Yeah.
I'm going to steal your comment though about, we make things better. And I think that is our ultimate measure of impact, right? So we have, I'm going to use some 2024 numbers, right? So RPA helped 100 different organizations send 3,250 grants totaling more than $500 million in 2024. That's one measure of success and impact, right? We run an organizational survey every year, and ultimately, if I were to boil it down, it's like those survey results. Are these organizations stronger than the year before? Are they stronger than when they started with us? Because we are all about making your idea, making a thing better. We are the accelerant, and we measure it through what we do, the way that we send money out, how many people we hired, how many projects we have. But then there's this sort of organizational strength and capability index, if you will. That's also an important measure. It's important for us. And then the projects themselves, of course, have their own measures of impact. I mentioned the Plastic Solutions Fund that's working in 65 countries, 272 organizations supported, ultimately trying to eliminate 70% of plastic use by 2040. So it's like this multi-layered impact measurement. What we can control is whether or not these organizations are strong enough to do their work, and then they can measure their work. So we make things better. I love that.
I'm going to use that too. Like I said, I send out tips to my group on a weekly basis. I call them Tuesday tips. Sometimes I send them out on Fridays just to keep people on their toes. But overridingly, I like to say things like that, and I'm going to say that to my team as far as what do we do in public accounting? We try to make things better. We're not trying to be adversarial. We're not, although sometimes it comes off that way. We're just trying to make the organizations we work with better with expertise that we've developed over 50 years, over a long period of time. So I'm going to use that because I think that that's a good way of thinking about what it is that we do for a living.
It is. It's awesome.
Yeah. Love every minute of that. So I learned something today too. So call to action, how can the public help you? You said it a little bit before, but if you want to restate it, but how does the public help you as RPA?
I love this question. Thank you for the opportunity to shamelessly pitch us. As I mentioned, we are in interesting times. And I truly believe that philanthropy and the nonprofit sector are more important than ever. I think we hear that every year, but I really believe it is critically important. So I think three things. If you're a donor and you're at a point where you're trying to understand your philanthropic life, contact our advisory team. They're super smart and they can help you structure your foundation, run it, or just give you ideas on where to give so that's aligned with your goals and your values, right? So back to the roadmap we just talked about. If you're a project or a donor collaborative and you aren't really sure about fiscal sponsorship or you're excited about it, you can reach out to us. We're really good at hosting and we do it incredibly economically. And third, I think maybe this is the most fun one. If you're a skeptic, and I have plenty of skeptics in my life, folks who have just decided that the world, the systems around us don't work. They're dysfunctional in ways that don't do anything good. That's not true. I would ask you to go learn, go deep. As Brad said, thank you, Brad. We have a lot of really good materials on our website. Take a learning journey. And I'm sure that somebody in our Inquiry Insights or thought leadership team would be happy to convince you that the world is actually good. There are lots of good things happening and RPA can help. You can obviously go to our website at rockpa.org. Email us at info@rockpa.org. And those are three things, you can do. If you're a donor, if you're a project, or if you're just skeptical, come to us. We can help.
Love it. Love it. I'm going to turn this around. And since I grilled you with questions, do you have any questions for me? Give the guest the opportunity to grill the host.
Just in the fiscal sponsorship space, what are you seeing as problems when you run in, if you've got some fiscal sponsors that you guys audit? Are there things that are recurring issues that I should be looking out for?
I think globally, infrastructure is a big thing. And if I think about, the myriad of clients we serve that operate in this space, it goes around. I boil it down to, there's a component of your company that you're providing certain services to sponsored projects. And to some variable degree, you're providing, technical accounting internally to report properly. You're providing technical advice. You're providing technology. You're providing a whole host of back office support. I think where the fiscal sponsorship space is phenomenal is as a result of that. So I think it's great that you offer all of that. I think the hard part is that you offer all of that. So you know what I mean? You're constantly, and then from a I'll call them clients for lack of a better word, donors, clients, people that are operating in this sponsored space or people that run the sponsored projects, how can you customize for all that? Do you have the ability to be nimble with that, or we have to offer a model a certain way? So I think the difficult part, or at least the thing that I find challenging, is at the end of the day, you're operating a significant number of projects. There's a significant number of revenue inflow. The accounting rules, no matter what anyone in the world says, I believe they're highly complex and open to interpretation. So you're interpreting all of these things. A lot of people in the world have differences of opinion. So when you're dealing with different people in the world, they may have a different opinion on how something should be treated. And I know that's like very granular accounting nerdy, but I do say that the biggest issue we come across, both in this space as well as in the greater giving world, is every revenue agreement's written differently. You're left to interpret all of those revenue agreements. And I think that it's an extreme challenge and burden. You have to have all these systems in place. You have to invest in the infrastructure. And I think that's very difficult to keep up with, especially with like the rapid pace of how technology is changing. I mean, even when I look in the last 5 years, I mean, every one of my clients has switched their accounting system in the last 5 to 10 years. Like they've updated it, and you have to, and then you have to keep up with all the ancillary systems and how do they talk to it. And then, companies are going out of business. Companies are spinning up. People throw this term AI out there, which just drives people up a loop, and it's like, oh, AI. It's like, yeah, but what does that mean? Like, tell me what that means, and then how does it impact my business? I find that that's extraordinarily difficult. And
yeah, I'm with you. It is
hard to manage.
It's a big management challenge, right? With all these projects that have so much variability in size, complexity, geography, like you name it. And it's something we face on a daily basis. And the easy answer is standardize. But, folks were like, nope. Oh, that's a great answer, though. Thank you.
It's true. Well, yeah. If I spin that a little bit differently, what is the most common question I get from 100% of my clients? How do I account for this revenue contract? And you know what? For rightful reason, because it's complicated. And from our perspective, we're like, yeah, send it over to us. We want to work with you on it. I can't review every one of your grant contracts because then I'm your internal control. But we can look at it today as opposed to looking at it a year from now when I request it in an audit. So why not look at it today? And I've always found that as a good philosophy of just a way of thinking about things, because if there's any issue that usually comes up, it's usually around like how revenue gets into books and records and how contracts are written, because sometimes you have contracts from donors that are all over the place. And it's, I'll be honest to say I have a hard time interpreting half of them. So it's, what is your system and methodology to apply that across thousands of contracts? It's a daunting task. So that's the nerdy accountant in me saying it.
Very creative in the way that they write things.
Oh, yeah. But you are in the client service business, my friend.
It's fun. It's really fun, and it's super interesting. I think it's good for a good purpose as well. So that keeps me going all the time.
Love it. Awesome. Well, I really appreciate, Alec, your time for coming on the show today. I appreciate, all the insight and wisdom you shared, some of the personal stories you shared, as well as just sharing a little bit more about what Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors does and the great work that you're doing in the world. I really appreciate it. I think the world appreciates it. And, you certainly are a great organization that can help many, and are doing that as you've proven over many, many years. So thank you so much for your time on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Brad. I really appreciate you having me on the show and for your partnership and friendship over this last decade.
No doubt. And Warriors, thank you for listening. Subscribe and meet us right back here for another episode of With Them Civic Warriors. Bye, everybody.